Every woman in that room was waiting for him to ask. She was the only one who said no. The candles had been lit twice that night, once by the footmen at dusk, and again by a quiet boy with singed fingers when the first round guttered under the weight of so much breath and laughter. And by the time the orchestra reached the third figure of the third dance, the great gallery of Hartwell House smelled of beeswax and orange water, and the faint ironwork sharpness of jewelry warmed by skin. Eleanora Vance stood at the edge of that smell with a glass of barley water she did not intend to drink. She had counted, without meaning to, the number of times her aunt had glanced at the doorway. 11. She had counted the steps from the window to the punch table. 22. She had counted the small, careful breaths it took to steady the tremor in her left hand, whenever her cousin Penelope laughed too loudly at her elbow. 4 was usually enough. Tonight, she had needed 7. The dare had been made an hour before, in a withdrawing room papered the color of bruised apricots, where 4 young women had sat on a velvet bench and decided, in the way young women sometimes decide things, that the evening required a wager. Penelope had spoken first, because Penelope always spoke first. She had said that no woman in England, given the chance, would refuse the Duke of Ashbourne a dance. She had said it as if it were a fact about weather, indisputable and slightly tiresome. Lady Margaret Carew had agreed with the dimpled satisfaction of someone who agreed with everything. The third girl, whose name Eleanora kept forgetting on purpose, had giggled. And then Penelope had turned her gaze on Eleanora, the way one turns a small key in a lock that one already knows is broken. 5 pounds, Penelope had said, and the smile beneath it was kind and not kind at once. 5 pounds, said even you, Nell, would say yes. Eleanora had set down her glass on the table between them. The glass had made a small, distinct sound. She had said, without lifting her eyes higher than the embroidery at Penelope's throat, that she would not need 5 pounds. She would refuse him for nothing. It had been a foolish thing to say. She knew that even as the words left her. Foolish because the Duke of Ashbourne never asked anyone, and the dare cost nothing to accept when the cost would never come due. Foolish because Penelope laughed too easily, and laughter in that house traveled like fire over dry grass. Foolish because Eleanora's mother had spent the last of 3/4 allowance on the silk of the dress she was wearing now, and ruin, in this season, traveled faster than laughter. But the words had been said. And so when the orchestra paused and the gallery quieted in that particular way a room quiets when something is about to walk into it, Eleanora did not turn her head. She did not need to. She felt the shift the way one feels a window opened in a distant part of the house, a thread of colder air, an alteration in the pressure of the candles. The dancers reorganized themselves into smaller, more attentive shapes. Mothers found their daughters by touch. Fathers found their watches. Even the footman at the doors stilled. He was, she would learn later, a man who entered rooms slowly because he had long ago discovered there was no advantage in entering them quickly. Tonight, he entered with one hand resting lightly inside the cuff of the other, as if holding himself in place. He did not look at the dancers. He looked instead at the high ceiling, at the long line where the gilt of the cornice met the painted summer of the plaster sky, and Eleanora, who had still not turned, watched the eyes of the room follow his. Penelope, beside her, exhaled the small, satisfied sound of a hunter who has heard her quarry step on a twig. He came down the gallery without haste. He greeted Lady Hartwell with a bow so precise it might have been measured with a ruler. He answered the master of ceremonies with a single word. He declined a glass of champagne with a gesture so small it was almost private. And then, because a duke must dance at a ball if he wishes the ball to be remembered, he turned and his gaze moved along the wall of waiting women the way a careful reader moves along a shelf of books whose spines he already knows. His gaze stopped at Eleonora. She had, until that moment, intended to look down. It would have been easier to look down. She had practiced looking down in the long mirror in her aunt's dressing room, where she had also practiced the half smile, the soft refusal, the small step backward that meant nothing and could be denied later. She had practiced everything that a girl with no fortune and an unfashionable cleverness practiced when she was sent to London for a season she could not afford. But she did not look down. She met his eyes, because she had told Penelope she would refuse him, and because it seemed to her, in the quick arithmetic of pride, that refusing a man whose eyes you had not met was not refusing him at all. His eyes were gray, not the warm gray of pigeons or pewter, but the cooler gray of slate after rain. And what surprised her was not their color, but their stillness. They held her without effort. They asked nothing and offered nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a great deal of his life being looked at, and who had learned to look back without flinching, and without much hope of being seen in return. He crossed the floor. The dancers seemed to part for him as water parts for a thrown stone. Penelope's hand tightened on Eleanor's wrist, a small, sharp pressure that meant, smile, smile now, do not ruin this. Eleonora did not smile. He stopped before her at the precise distance etiquette required, neither closer nor farther, and he bowed. The bow was not deep. It did not need to be. A duke's bow at a public ball was a small inclination of the head and shoulders, a courtesy and a contract at once, and his was perfectly judged. When he straightened, he did not smile either. He looked at her as if she were the one detail in the room he had not yet accounted for. "May I have the honor," he said, "of the next dance?" There was no question mark at the end of his sentence. He did not give it one. Dukes did not, as a rule, ask questions at balls. They offered, and the world arranged itself around the offer. Behind Eleonora, Penelope made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a gasp. And across the gallery, she felt her aunt rise an inch on the balls of her satin shoes, as if to be ready to faint with more dignity. Eleonora curtsied. The curtsy was correct in every particular. She had practiced it in front of the same mirror. She rose, and she met his slate-gray eyes again, and she said in the clear, low voice that her grandmother had once told her was the only thing about her that no dressmaker could improve. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I would rather not." For a long moment the gallery did nothing. The orchestra had begun the opening bars of the next set, and a single oboe wandered through the silence with the patient confusion of an animal that has lost its herd. The candles, twice lit, burned on. Somewhere, far down the room, a woman dropped a fan and did not bend to retrieve it. Eleonora did not look away. She had, in the small private corner of her mind where she kept her courage as one keeps a kitchen knife, decided that the only way to survive what she had just done was to not perform it. She would not flush. She would not stammer. She would not soften the refusal with an excuse about a turned ankle or a previous engagement that did not exist. She had said no, and the no would stand by itself. And if the gallery hated her for it, the gallery would have to hate her in plain English. The Duke's expression did not change. That, more than anything, was what undid her composure later, in the carriage, when she could no longer hold the shape of her face. He did not frown. He did not stiffen. The fine, level line of his mouth did not move. Only, and only for an instant, a very small alteration occurred in his eyes, as if a shutter at the back of a long, dim room had opened a quarter of an inch and let in a thread of light. He inclined his head, no more than half an inch, and accepted the refusal the way a chess player accepts an unexpected opening move from a player he had been about to dismiss as a child. "Of course," he said. "Forgive my presumption." He bowed again. The second bow was no deeper than the first, but it was different. Eleonora, who had spent most of her life being looked through, recognized the difference at once. The first bow had been a courtesy paid to a stranger. The second was a courtesy paid to someone he had noticed. He turned. He walked, without haste, to the far side of the gallery, where Lady Margaret Carew stood beside her mother with a smile she had been holding for an hour. And he bowed to her, and she curtsied, and the orchestra, with audible relief, found the rhythm it had lost. Couples assembled. The dance began. Penelope dragged Eleonora into a doorway by the elbow and hissed something that Eleonora did not hear, because Eleonora was watching the Duke's hand at Lady Margaret's waist, and noticing, with a precision she had not asked for, that the hand was placed at exactly the distance etiquette required and not a finger breadth closer. She would learn, in the days that followed, that he had not danced more than once at any ball that season. She would learn that he had been raised by an uncle who believed conversation was an indulgence and rooms were a kind of weather to be endured. She would learn that he kept a small notebook in his breast pocket in which he wrote down, in a hand so neat it looked printed, the names of the books he intended to read and the names of the people he intended to remember. But she did not know any of this yet. She knew only that her aunt had not yet looked at her, that Penelope had not yet stopped speaking, and that her own hands, hidden in the folds of the silk her mother could not afford, had begun at last to tremble. She counted the breaths it took to still them. 7 was not enough. Tonight, she needed 12. It would be reported, by the next afternoon, in 3 drawing rooms and 4 breakfast tables and 1 letter sent express to a country house in Hampshire, that Miss Vance of Wiltshire, niece of Lady Carmody and granddaughter of the late and unfashionable Admiral Vance, had refused the Duke of Ashbourne a dance at the Hartwell ball. It would be reported, with varying degrees of accuracy, that she had done so coldly, or stupidly, or with a smirk, or in tears. The truth, which was none of these, would not travel. The truth seldom did. What did travel, though no one in those drawing rooms could have explained it, was the slate-gray thread of light that had opened for an instant behind the Duke's eyes when she said no. That light traveled with him out of the Hartwell Gallery, into his carriage, up the wide stone stairs of his house in Berkeley Square, into the library where he sat for a long time without lighting a candle, and finally into the small notebook in his breast pocket, where, in his neat, printed hand, he wrote a single line beneath the date. Miss Vance, Wiltshire, refused. Inquire further. He underlined the last 2 words once, neatly, as a man underlines an instruction he intends to keep. The next morning, Eleanor awoke before the maid, which was something she had not done since leaving home. The window of her small back bedroom in her aunt's house in Half Moon Street faced an alley that smelled, on damp mornings, of coal smoke and the bread oven of the chop house across the way. She had taken the room willingly because it was the room no one else wanted. She had hung above the narrow bed a square of embroidered linen her mother had given her on the morning she left, a square that bore, in faded blue thread, the words, "Be useful and be kind." And Eleonora had begun, in the last weeks, to think the embroidery had been a polite way of saying, "Do not expect to be loved for what you are." She lay in the bed and listened to the city wake. She heard the cart of the milkwoman, the bell of the muffin man, the soft, complaining cough of her uncle 3 rooms away, the quick step of the housemaid carrying coals. She heard, beneath all of it, the small, exact memory of her own voice saying, "I would rather not." And she found, to her surprise, that she did not regret it. She regretted only that the saying of it had been a wager. She regretted that the truest thing she had done in London had been done for £5 she did not need and a cousin she did not love. She rose. She dressed in the green wool that did not bear inspection in strong light. She went down to the breakfast room, and she discovered that her aunt was waiting for her there with a face that had been arranged at considerable effort to be serene. "Sit down, Nell," her aunt said. "We must talk about your future." Eleanor sat. She poured a careful cup of tea. She waited. The future, as it turned out, was a card on a silver salver, brought in by the butler with the small, odd step of a man who has been entrusted with a relic. The card was thick, cream, and engraved in a hand so plain it could only have been chosen by someone with nothing to prove. It bore, in the center, 3 words and a name. His Grace requests. Beneath, in a different hand, written in ink that was still faintly wet, were the words, "The honor of calling upon Miss Vance this afternoon at 3 o'clock, if she is at home." Her aunt's serenity broke into pieces on the breakfast table. Penelope, summoned from her bedroom, arrived in a wrapper and a cloud of injured perfume. Her uncle, summoned from his coffee, arrived with his newspaper still in his hand. The card was passed from one to the other as if it were a hot coal. Eleanor drank her tea. She did not pick the card up. "He will not come," Penelope said at last, with the bright certainty of someone who needed the statement to be true. "It is a joke, Nell. He is making a joke at your expense." "He does not," Eleanor said quietly, "look like a man who makes jokes." Her aunt, who had recovered her speech, began a speech about gowns and hair and the necessity of speaking very little when great men called, and the necessity, above all, of correcting any unfortunate impression that might have been given the previous evening by a fit of girlish nerves. Eleanor, who had not had a fit of girlish nerves in her life, listened politely. She had learned long ago that the easiest way to manage her aunt was to let her aunt arrange the air of a room without interfering with the furniture. At 3 o'clock, the Duke of Ashbourne arrived in Half Moon Street in a carriage so plain it might have belonged to a country attorney. He was shown into the front parlor, where Eleanor's aunt had arranged herself, Penelope, 2 cousins, a vase of forced lilies, and a small, panting spaniel, in such a way as to suggest a household entirely at ease. The Duke bowed. He sat in the chair that was offered. He drank, with grave courtesy, a cup of tea he did not want. He answered, with grave courtesy, every question Eleanor's aunt put to him about the weather, the roads, the health of the king, and the prospects of the harvest in the south. He did not, for a quarter of an hour, look at Eleanor at all. And then, when the spaniel had been removed, and Penelope had been instructed by a glance to fetch more hot water, and the cousins had been sent to admire the lilies from a distance, he turned in his chair toward where Eleanor sat in the window seat, half hidden by the curtain, and he said, in a voice pitched only for her, "Miss Vance, I understand I owe you an apology." Eleanor set down her cup. She looked at him properly for the first time in daylight. In daylight, his face was less remote and more tired than it had been by candlelight. There was a small scar at his temple, very fine, the kind a child gets from falling against a fender. There was a softness at the corner of his mouth that he had not allowed himself the night before. "I cannot think for what," she said. "For asking," he said, "when the room had made it impossible for you to refuse without being punished for refusing. I did not understand, last night, that I was placing you in such a position. I understood it on the drive home. I have come to say so." Eleanor was silent. She had prepared, on the staircase, 3 or 4 different replies to 3 or 4 different openings she had imagined. None of them fit. None of them came close. She had imagined hauteur. She had imagined gallantry. She had imagined the cool, glancing flirtation of a man amused by a novelty. She had not imagined this, which was the plain, careful speech of a man taking responsibility for a small unkindness he had not known he was committing. She said, after a moment, "You are very generous, Your Grace." "I am not," he said. "I am only attentive. There is a difference." He paused. He turned the teacup a quarter turn in its saucer, as if he had only just remembered he was holding it. Then he set it down. He folded his hands very precisely on his knee. "I would like," he said, "to ask you again. Not here, not under your aunt's roof, where a refusal would be costly to you. Somewhere of your choosing, at a time of your choosing, with no witnesses but the person you trust most in the world. I would like to ask you to dance with me, Miss Vance. And I would like you to feel free, on that occasion, to refuse me a second time, if that is what you wish. I will not take the second refusal less well than the first." She heard, in the next room, the small clatter of her aunt's teacup against its saucer, and she understood at once that her aunt had been listening at the door. She understood also that the Duke had pitched his voice so quietly that her aunt had heard the cadence but not the words. He had done it on purpose. He had given Eleonora the gift of a private conversation in a house where privacy did not exist. She looked at him for a long moment. The slate-gray eyes held her without pressure. The thread of light she had seen the night before was there again, a quarter-inch wider. "I shall think about it," she said. He inclined his head. "Of course." He rose. He bowed to her aunt, who had appeared in the doorway with the precise, surprised expression of a woman who had not been listening at all. He bowed again to Eleonora. He left. When the door closed behind him, Penelope, who had reappeared with the hot water, set the jug down so hard a little of it sprang out onto the cloth. Eleanor's aunt sat down in the nearest chair and asked, without breath, what he had said. Eleanor answered with perfect truthfulness that the Duke had been very civil. She did not say more. She did not, in fact, speak much for the rest of the day. She went up to her small back bedroom, and she sat on the bed beneath the embroidered square, and she read again, in the faded blue thread, the instruction to be useful and to be kind. And she wrote, in the small commonplace book she kept hidden in the lining of her trunk, a single line beneath the date. He asked. I did not answer. I am thinking. She underlined the last two words neatly, as a woman underlines an instruction she intends to keep. The second meeting did not happen in a ballroom. It happened, 3 days later, in the reading room of a circulating library on Bond Street, on a Wednesday afternoon when the rain was loud enough on the high windows to make conversation in low voices both natural and unremarkable. Eleonora had gone there to return a volume of sermons her aunt had insisted she borrow. She had taken with her, in defiance, a slim French grammar her grandfather had given her on her 12th birthday, and a notebook in which she had been, for some weeks, copying out the verbs she did not yet know. She had chosen the library because it was the one public room in London in which a woman of small means could sit for an hour without being asked to account for herself. He was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the long table where the newspapers were laid out, reading, without apparent interest, an account of the price of wheat. He did not look up when she came in. He waited until she had returned the sermons and chosen a chair by the window and arranged her grammar and her notebook on the small table beside her. And only then did he cross the room and stop, at a perfectly judged distance, beside her chair. "May I sit?" he said. She considered him. The reading room was nearly empty. An elderly clergyman dozed in a corner over a folded paper. A young woman in a brown pelisse turned the pages of a novel with the absorbed slowness of someone who was not actually reading. "You may," she said. He sat. He did not for some time speak. He looked instead at the rain on the high window, as if the rain were an old acquaintance whose conversation he preferred to most others. She returned with deliberate composure to her verbs. She had reached, by some quiet conspiracy of the page and her own concentration, the fourth conjugation when he spoke again. "You are studying French," he said. "I am studying," she said, "the verbs of which I am not yet certain. The rest I trust." "It is a good principle," he said. "Most things in life come down to the verbs of which we are not yet certain." She looked up. He was not smiling. He was looking at the rain. He said, without turning his head, "I should like to tell you something, Miss Vance. I would prefer to tell you here rather than in your aunt's parlor, because here you may stand up and walk away from me without anyone marking it. There." He nodded, very slightly, at the door. She put down her pen. She folded her hands over the open grammar. She said, "I am listening." "I have," he said, "an arrangement. It is not a betrothal. It is not even, properly, an understanding. It is a wish expressed in writing by my mother on her deathbed, and a wish acknowledged in writing by the mother of a young woman of suitable family. It binds neither of us in law or in honor. It is, in plain language, an old letter in a drawer. But it exists, and I would not wish you to learn of its existence from someone else, and to think, because I had not told you, that I had hidden it." He paused. The rain on the window kept its steady counting. "I am telling you this," he said, "because I have decided I should like to know you better. I have decided this slowly, against my usual habits, and on the basis of a single sentence which you spoke to me at a ball, and a single afternoon in which you said almost nothing at all. I cannot account for the decision, and I will not insult you by pretending I can. I tell you only that it has been made." Eleanora looked at her hands. She noticed, with the small, irrelevant clarity that came to her at important moments, that her left thumbnail had a tiny crescent of ink where she had blotted the page too quickly. She thought about the letter in the drawer. She thought about her aunt. She thought about her mother, in the long, stone-floored hall at home in Wiltshire, opening the post each morning with the patient, hopeful gesture of a woman who had stopped expecting anything in particular, but still rose early to look. She thought, last, about Penelope, who had laid the dare on the velvet bench in the apricot-papered room, and who would never, in 100 years, understand what Eleanora was about to say. "I am grateful," she said, "that you have told me. I am also grateful," she said, "that you have allowed me to stand up and walk away." She closed the grammar. She put it, with the notebook, into the small reticule at her wrist. She rose. He rose with her immediately, as a man rises when a woman whose pleasure he wishes to keep stands up in his presence. She curtsied. He bowed. And then she said, in the low, clear voice that her grandmother had once told her was the only thing about her no dressmaker could improve, "I am not, however, going to walk away." The slate-gray eyes did not move from her face. "I should be glad," she said, "to know you better also, on the understanding that the letter in the drawer remains a letter in a drawer, and that we are not in any way hurrying. I am, as it happens, in no hurry at all." He inclined his head. There was a small, decided alteration at the corner of his mouth, no more than a softening. "Thank you," he said. He hesitated. Then, because he was a man who had been raised by an uncle who believed conversation was an indulgence, and who had spent the better part of his life learning, very slowly, to speak about things that mattered, he added, in a voice almost too low for the rain to allow, "I had thought, Miss Vance, that I had made up my mind never to marry a woman who had not first been able to refuse me. I had not, until last week, understood how unlikely that had made it." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. It was a small laugh, Not loud, not bright, but it was real, and it surprised them both. The clergyman in the corner did not wake. The young woman in the brown pelisse turned another page she was not reading. "You will understand," she said, "that I cannot promise to refuse you again." "I will not," he said, "ask anything of you that requires you to promise such a thing. I will ask only that, when you do refuse me, you do it as well as you did the first time." She sat down. He sat down. The rain on the high window kept its steady counting. They did not say much else that afternoon. She returned to her verbs. He returned, eventually, to the price of wheat. But the small table between them had become, without either of them naming it, a kind of room within the room. A room with a door that opened only inward and that, for the moment, neither of them wished to leave. He called in the weeks that followed, with a regularity that was almost startling for its lack of display. He never came twice in the same week to her aunt's house. He arranged instead that they met, often by chance and once or twice by design, in places where conversation could happen without being curated. They met in the long gallery of the British Museum, where he showed her, with the shy precision of a man unused to showing anyone anything, a small Greek bowl in a glass case that had been broken and mended in antiquity, the old crack repaired with a line of gold. They met at a music room in Hanover Square, where a young Italian woman sang an aria so simply that Eleonora cried without meaning to, and where the Duke, sitting beside her, did not look at her crying and did not pretend not to see it. They met in the park, twice, by an arrangement they did not commit to paper, and walked the long avenue beside the Serpentine while Penelope, who had been sent as a chaperone, lagged behind in a sulk so wide it could be heard. They spoke, in those weeks, of small things. They spoke of books, of which she had read more than he had expected, and he had read more than she had expected. And they laughed, once, at the discovery that they had each, in different decades, fallen asleep over the same volume of sermons. They spoke of the country, which she missed and which he had been taught to mistrust. They spoke of the price of bread, which she knew exactly and which he, to his credit, did not pretend to know at all. They did not speak, ever, of the letter in the drawer. They did not need to. The letter was a fact like the weather, and the weather, that spring, was kinder than London usually allowed. It was the young woman of suitable family who eventually spoke of the letter, and she did it with a grace that surprised everyone but the Duke. Her name was Lady Sophronia Wynne, and she was, by general agreement, the most placid and least curious creature in 3 counties. She arrived in London at the end of April with her mother, took one look at the Duke and at Eleonora in the same room at a small evening party in Cavendish Square, and wrote, the next morning, a short letter in her round, unhurried hand, releasing the Duke from a wish she had never been consulted about. She enclosed with the letter a sprig of dried lavender and a single sentence. "I find I should prefer, on consideration, a man who likes dogs more than I do." The Duke read the letter aloud to Eleonora at the bowl in the British Museum, and Eleonora, who liked dogs less than Lady Sophronia did, said only that Lady Sophronia had excellent judgment. It was the closest she came, in the whole of that spring, to speaking of the letter at all. The quiet climax, when it came, was so quiet that neither of them recognized it at first. It happened on a Thursday in early May, in the small back garden of the house in Half Moon Street, which was not really a garden, but a square of soot-streaked paving with a single sycamore that the soot had not yet defeated. Eleonora had gone out to cut 3 sprigs of mint for her aunt's evening tisane. The Duke had come, by arrangement this time, to call on her uncle on a matter of business that had nothing to do with her, and that her uncle had, with rare delicacy, prolonged just long enough to allow the Duke to step into the back garden afterward in search of her. He found her with the kitchen scissors in her hand, and a smudge of soot on her wrist where she had brushed the sycamore. He said, without preamble, "You have made me very happy these last weeks." She said, without looking up from the mint, "I am glad." He said, "I should like to ask you a question. You may refuse it without explanation, and I will not raise it again." She set down the scissors. She turned. She looked at him, properly, the way she had looked at him in the gallery on the first night, without softness and without armor. "Ask," she said. He asked. He did not kneel. He did not flourish. He asked the question in the voice he had used in the reading room about the verbs of which one is not yet certain. He asked it as a man asks a thing he has thought about for a long time and would rather not think about any longer. She did not answer at once. She turned instead to the sycamore. She put her hand on its rough bark. She felt the soot come off on her palm. She thought of her mother in the long stone-floored hall in Wiltshire. She thought of Penelope on the velvet bench in the apricot-papered room. She thought of the embroidered square above her narrow bed and the blue thread already beginning to fade. She thought of the slate-gray eyes and the small alteration at the corner of his mouth and the line of gold in the old Greek bowl. She thought of all of it, and she did not hurry. And he, who had been raised by an uncle who believed conversation was an indulgence, did not fill the silence. When she turned back to him, she found that the answer had arranged itself in her throat in the only words it could have used. "Yes," she said. "Quite." He inclined his head, no more than half an inch, the same half inch he had given her in the gallery on the night she had refused him. But this time, the thread of light behind his eyes did not close. It stayed open. It broke, quietly, into something she had no other name for than gladness. He did not kiss her. He took her hand, the one without soot, and he held it briefly, and he let it go. He said, "I shall write to your mother tonight." He said, "I shall not write to your aunt until tomorrow, so that you may tell her first." He said, with the smallest, driest smile she had yet seen him allow, "I think you have refused me as well as we ought to expect, and I am content to leave it there." She laughed again. The sycamore, which was the kind of tree that declined to comment. They were married in the end, in the small church in her mother's village in Wiltshire, on a morning when the hedgerow was so obliging as to put out its first true cream of hawthorn. Her mother stood by the gate in a dress that had been 3 times turned and looked, for the first time in a decade, like a woman who had stopped opening the post out of habit. Lady Sophronia Wynne sent, by way of a wedding gift, a small, well-trained spaniel and a note that said only, "Be useful and be kind," which, since she had never met Eleanora's mother, was either a coincidence or a sign that some embroideries travel further than one expects. Penelope, who had been invited out of duty, came with a new bonnet and a smile she had been holding for a month, and she announced in the churchyard afterward that she had always known. Eleanora, who had stopped counting Penelope's announcements long ago, kissed her on the cheek and asked after her health. The gatekeeping aunts of the season, who had spent the spring composing the various ways in which Miss Vance had ruined herself, were obliged by autumn to compose new sentences. Lady Hartwell, in whose gallery the refusal had been delivered, took credit for the whole affair on the grounds that she had lit the candles twice. Penelope married, within the year, a curate who admired her very much, and who, by the kindness of Providence, was slightly hard of hearing. Eleanora's uncle, who had prolonged the business meeting in the front parlor on the day in the back garden, was rewarded by his nephew-in-law with a small, undemanding office in the country that suited his cough. The Italian singer of the aria in Hanover Square went on to greater rooms. The clergyman in the corner of the reading room slept in due course into a softer corner of the next world. The small Greek bowl, mended with gold, remained in its case at the museum and was visited twice a year by a tall, quiet man and a woman with ink on her thumb, who stood before it without speaking and went away each time a little gladder than they had come. And now, friend, if you have stayed by the fire this long, come a little closer. The candles have been lit twice tonight as well, and the kettle is doing its small, patient work on the hob. And I have been telling you a story that is not really about a duke or a ball or a refusal at all. It is about the small, unfashionable courage it takes to say what is true when the room is waiting for you to say what is easy. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room and counted your breaths, if you have ever been the one who was overlooked and learned to be quiet about being overlooked, if you have ever felt the cost of a single honest sentence and chosen all the same to spend it, then you know already what Eleanora knew when she set down her scissors by the sycamore. You know that being seen, when it comes at last, almost always comes quietly, in a back garden, at a small hour, in plain clothes. Tell me, if you would, which moment stayed with you? Was it the first refusal in the bright gallery, or the second in the reading room that was not a refusal after all? Was it the line of gold in the old bowl, or the embroidered square above the narrow bed, or the small alteration at the corner of a mouth that had been taught not to alter? Sit with it for a moment. Stories like this are made to be sat with. And if you would like to stay by the fire a little longer, pull the chair a little closer and let this small fire know you mean to come back. There will be another story when the kettle has cooled and the candles have been lit a third time, and another after that, and another, for as long as there are quiet refusals worth remembering and quiet yeses worth waiting for. Until then, be useful and be kind. And sleep gently. The fire will keep.